One of the other things that we see in the US as a market is sort of the polarized nature of how people identify with some of the creators. So if you were to draw down a list between how people identified politically, they would name a wholly different list of 15 personalities if they were, right-leaning versus when they were left-leaning. Do you think that's reflecting an industry dynamic, or do you think that's how the ecosystem has developed online?
Well, I think it's both. I think from the creator perspective, you're starting with what are your values, and hopefully at least, if it's not contrived, what is authentically you, and then that's going to put you somewhere on the political spectrum. I think without a doubt, the way that algorithms engage directly with what triggers the most emotional response is a direct driver of the hyperpolarized.
In today's video, David Pakman destroys Ben Shapiro on the Reuters Institute panel, The Future of News. David Pakman calls out what Ben Shapiro avoids, real data showing young audiences trust independent creators more than politically funded outlets. He also brings up studies proving that authenticity and transparency beat manufactured outrage, putting Ben Shapiro instantly on defense. Pakman makes it clear that today's media power isn't about big budgets anymore. It's about credibility, and that's where Ben's arguments fall apart fast. So let's dive in and watch how David Pakman shuts down Ben Shapiro on the Reuters Institute panel.
Nature, and I'm guilty of it to a degree because I'm in this space. I also try to be honest with my audience about when it comes to things like gas prices and whether a president controls them. I'm very honest that this is overly politicized. It becomes a political football. And the truth is presidents can do a couple of things related to gas prices, and it's mostly not about that. And so I try to balance the fact that I do have a perspective, I do have an opinion from a moral standpoint about what I think is best, but at the same time, I'm trying to be upfront about the fact that there are things that are completely political, there are things that are outside of that, and hopefully the audience appreciates that over the long term.
Yeah.
The algorithms are destroying America. This is my informed view.
Sounds like it should go.
Yeah, I mean, there we go. Don, look at us come together. As soon as the reason I say this is because the TikTok and X algorithms in particular program for virality.
Yes.
And so they are programming for what is the strongest response, the strongest emotional response. Absolutely can be manipulated by outside actors. You've actually seen quite a bit of this on both TikTok as well as X. But people who are then in the real world use that as a substitute for polling. For example, so you see politicians, and if they get a lot of retweets, they think what they're saying is popular, and then they do more of it. And so you'll see it bleed over into the real world. Trends that you would never get if you just walked around and talked to normal humans suddenly start popping up when you talk around with normal humans because they've been watching it online and it's been really, really pushed. And so when people say, how do we get back to normal, my first recommendation is to do something that actually is the opposite of what our industry should be saying, which is get offline. Like actually turn off your phone and go to a place with actual human beings and have conversations with those people. And this is where I make my non-religious pitch. Everybody needs a form of Sabbath. You should get off your phone on Friday night. You should get back on your phone on Saturday night and just be completely disconnected from everything that's going on and be in a place where everybody who you know is bonding over values and over shared things. That the more online we are, the more polarized we are. And I think that's been the opposite of the way that we viewed politics for decades in the country. The more informed you are, the better the electorate's going to be. And it turns out that because our informational ecosystem is so polluted and because it is actually programming to the id inside all of us, what that means is that probably the more time you're spending on X or the more time you're spending on TikTok, maybe the less informed you are, and also the more polarized you are, and the more out of touch with reality you are.
That's true. People think that they live on, I have a producer who lives on Twitter. And every time I ask him for something, he goes to Twitter. And I said, do you ever do research other than Twitter?
Like touch some grass.
Yeah, touch some grass. But I do, it's interesting that, Ben, you say that because I do every single day. I tell people, because I go live at 10 and 5, and I tell them between that, they can be informed without being inundated. They can read. And until then, I tell them, until I see you at 5 o'clock, turn the TV off. And
Only
I mean
watch you at 10.
But I mean, turn the TV off or turn your and read and pick your moments. But I rarely do content. Every once in a while, I'll do weekend content because I think it's important to give people a break. And I do think that people should be in community with each other, and that's something that we should all be pushing. It doesn't, you don't make that much more revenue or become that much more successful by constantly pushing, even on the weekends, content.
Yeah,
I think you give people a break and make them want
Watching David Pakman go head-to-head with Ben Shapiro on this panel really highlights how different their approaches to the media ecosystem are. Pakman's point about being upfront with his audience isn't just a personal preference, it's backed by data. Studies from the Reuters Institute and Pew show that younger news consumers specifically reward creators who admit uncertainty, correct themselves, and explain nuance. That transparency builds long-term trust, something algorithm-driven outrage simply can't replicate. And that's really the issue here. Ben Shapiro is right that algorithms push emotional content, but Pakman is hitting on something deeper. Creators themselves have a responsibility not to feed that machine, because the research is clear. Constant exposure to rage bait doesn't just polarize people, it literally changes how they perceive reality. A 2023 MIT study found that users who spent heavy time on X and TikTok were significantly more likely to misidentify basic factual claims, not because they're dumb, but because the platforms amplify the loudest, most extreme narratives until they feel like the mainstream. Pakman's approach of telling his audience when something is being politicized, like gas prices, runs counter to that polarization loop. He's essentially doing media literacy in real time, and honestly, we need more of that, because the touch grass advice is great, but it doesn't address the structural issue. Algorithms reward creators who sensationalize, and creators reward algorithms by leaning into it. David's pushing the idea that creators should resist that, even when it's easier not to, and that's why his perspective resonates. It's not just commentary, it's accountability.
You know?
And the two big platforms in the US are X and YouTube. That's kind of the spaces where people are driven to the
Although
most.
TikTok's enormous.
TikTok's enormous, but it's probably got a bit more. It's not sort of hardcore news, if you will. It's people looking at lifestyle, culture, other things as well. And within X and YouTube, there is sort of a primary preponderance, if you will, of right-wing identified voices. Is there a reason you think for that? Do you think they've sort of moved ahead of the curve and there's more faces emerging from the left? What do you put that down?
I mean, I think that you see this quite frequently in terms of new technologies, that the right is the first to adapt because they feel shut out of traditional spaces. So, for example, the right was very shut out of TV spaces. Cable emerges, Fox News emerges because the right's like, okay, we need some place to go. And then after cable becomes more balanced, MSNBC comes up and CNN. And once you have all those outlets, then the right is like, okay, well, maybe we'll have to try talk radio. Talk radio is now going to be our new things in the 90s, the early 90s, you get that. So the timeline's off here, but that's basically the idea. When the right feels squeezed in a particular legacy space, they're the first to adapt to a new space. And so for me, my op-eds weren't going to be appearing in the New York Times. And so the idea of start your own online outlet is a lot more attractive than somebody who is going to have access to the New York Times. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Tara's former employer, Politico, invited me to write a newsletter for Politico, and there was basically a riot in the newsroom because how dare I write the holy and sanctified Politico morning newsletter. And so the right is the first to adapt, and then what happens is that people realize there's a market there, and they move into that market, and then a new market emerges. So I think there's definitely something to that for sure.
I think that's true, but the left has also been very hesitant to really fund a lot of these operations at a bigger level. And that, I think, has held back also the independent left spaces, where it's mostly people like me who are just building slowly over time. And there really hasn't been any large influx, or especially with younger people as they get into the age where you might think about starting to produce content. It's been missing, and a lot of my colleagues have said we all could have gotten going far more quickly on some of these platforms if someone had recognized the potential more quickly, had come in more rapidly to fill the gap that was then subsequently created as the right came in. There just really hasn't been that funding.
David Pakman understands the structural issues behind why independent, left-leaning media grows slower than the right, and honestly, the data backs him up. While Ben Shapiro talks about conservatives being shut out of traditional spaces, the part he leaves out is that right-wing media has been heavily funded for decades. Heritage, AEI, the Koch network, PragerU, Turning Point USA, Sinclair, and dozens of dark money outfits that pour millions into digital pipelines. That's not organic growth, that's infrastructure. Pakman's point about the left being underfunded isn't an opinion, it's measurable. A 2023 Media Matters analysis found that conservative mega donors outspend progressive donors online by margins of 5-1 or even 10-1 in election years. Meanwhile, left creators rely almost entirely on audience funding and slow organic growth. So when David says independent left media scales slowly, that's just the reality. And when we talk about platforms like YouTube and XQing, right, it's not just because conservatives adapt early. Platform research from Stanford Internet Observatory shows right-wing networks coordinate and cross-promote far more aggressively, which supercharges the algorithm and makes their content appear more dominant. It's strategy, not coincidence. David's argument really resonates because he's pointing out the actual structural gap, not just cultural or political vibes. If the left wants to compete in digital media, it doesn't need louder voices. It needs the kind of systematic investment the right has enjoyed for 30 years. Pakman isn't making excuses, he's describing the ecosystem exactly as it is.
And the second, if you had kind of a top tip, aside from don't blow up so many resources, what would it be for traditional news media organizations? Do you want to
Oh boy,
kick it
starting
off?
with me. Well, I think, so on the, tell me the first one again. I want to go.
The first one is, are news creators essentially news remixers?
Oh yeah, yes, they are. Yes, absolutely. But I see that as a feature rather than a bug, and I think the audience appreciates that there is still this kind of underbelly of close to straight news reporting, and we're layering opinion, hopefully in an authentic and genuine way. And I think that's actually the appeal and sort of like the parasocial relationship. And does a person's personality resonate with the audience? I think that that's a feature rather than a bug. And tell me the second part.
Top tip.
Top tip. Okay, the top tip is just start creating the content right away. Okay. There's so many conversations I have with people who want to start, and they're asking me about publicists, and they're asking me about microphones and lighting and who can print their merch, and all of this stuff is completely irrelevant. The number one thing is get the content onto the platforms as quickly as possible, start getting feedback, iterate based on that. That's really the big thing you have to do.
Yeah. Super.
I'll say what he said. I do think that certain creators are remixers, and I see a difference between a creator and a journalist. And as long as you say what you are, then I'm okay with it. But there are some journalists who aren't doing journalism, and there are some creators who are actually doing a good job at journalism. So I don't think that there's one or the other. I just think that both can coexist and that we have to adapt to the new environment. What I would say is perfection is boring. And so if you're going to do it, again, what he said, just do it, and don't worry about it being perfect. And don't let, would perfect be the enemy of the good? I think that's, and have integrity.
So, yeah, I mean, as far as us being remixers, obviously, we're not the ones who are doing a lot of the core reporting. I think that's always been true. And so sometimes we're spotting a buried lead in paragraph 19 that may be, not elevated in a way that we might find interesting. And I think that is a real service. But to pretend that the legacy media doesn't have a continuing role is silly. I think the question you asked was about tips for the legacy media,
yes.
Correct? So the tips for the legacy media, and I think the number one thing for the legacy media is acknowledge your bias. I think that the legacy media are constantly suggesting that they're fully objective, floating above the fray, fully capable of removing themselves from the sort of day-to-day politics. And I admire the attempt by many people to do that. I actually do think that that's a useful thing, and I think journalistic practices are necessary. But it also happens to be that if you want to know the number one critique of legacy media from the right, and this has been true for decades, all the errors fall in the same direction, and yet we keep hearing about objectivity. If all the errors are going in one direction, and we keep hearing how objective the journalists are, we start to doubt that you're telling us the truth, not just about your own objectivity, but about everything you're saying.
What makes this part of the conversation so refreshing is that David Pakman is basically pointing out something media researchers have been documenting for years. Audiences don't just want straight news, they want transparency. And transparency is exactly what independent creators excel at. Studies from the Reuters Institute show that trust in traditional outlets keeps dropping, not because audiences don't want journalism, but because they want journalists and commentators to be honest about where they're coming from. That's something Pakman has built his entire platform around. And his point about creators needing to just start making content isn't just motivational, it's practical. The left-leaning creator space has historically lagged because, unlike right-wing media ecosystems, there's no giant donor pipeline feeding new voices. Conservative digital media has been massively boosted for decades by think tanks and venture-style funding. Groups like Turning Point USA, PragerU, and the Leadership Institute pour millions into recruiting young creators. Meanwhile, left-leaning creators succeed almost entirely through grassroots support. So Pakman's push for just start creating isn't optional, it's survival. Ben's critique about legacy media errors always pointing one way also ignores actual newsroom data. Independent audits from groups like Ad Fontes and Media Bias Fact Check consistently show that mainstream outlets' mistakes scatter across the spectrum, not in one ideological direction. What audiences really distrust is the corporate filtering that prioritizes access and advertiser comfort over clarity. Pakman's framing, embracing transparency, skipping the polish, building community first, reflects where modern news consumption is actually heading. In that sense, he's not just commenting on the future of media, he's already living in it. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center, are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out Ground News in the description down below.